The first time I really noticed him was the morning my key broke off in the lock. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would write about. The key just snapped. Clean, like it had been waiting for the right moment to give up. And I stood there on the front porch of the house I'd shared with my husband for 4 years, holding half a piece of metal, thinking, this is my life right now. I didn't cry. I'd already used up most of my crying the week before, when Garrett sat me down at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, the one we'd picked out together at that estate sale in Providence, and told me he wanted a divorce. Not that he was unhappy. Not that he'd fallen out of love. Just said he wanted a different future. He said it like he was declining a job offer. I was 29 years old, a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, and I had apparently become someone's wrong turn. The neighbor across the street, I'd seen him a handful of times, maybe, came out with his coffee while I was still standing there with my broken key. He was tall, dark-haired, the kind of quiet that feels intentional rather than shy. He had a dog, a big brindle mastiff named Gordo, who was already nosing at the hydrangeas along the fence. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at the key in my hand, then at the door, then back at me. Locksmith or credit card, he said. Excuse me, how do you want to handle it? It wasn't really a question. I blinked. I don't know. He set his coffee on the porch railing, walked across the street in his socks, and within 4 minutes had coaxed the broken piece out with his pocket knife and gotten my door open. He handed me the pieces of a key like they were evidence, like I'd want to keep them. Thank you, I said. He nodded once. Went back to get his coffee. Didn't introduce himself. I found out his name later from my mail. A package left at my door by mistake, addressed to Eli Soto, 14 Carver Street. I left it on his porch without knocking. The divorce was quick in the way that avalanches are quick. 1 minute, everything was in place, and then it wasn't, and the speed of it was the most disorienting part. Garrett had a lawyer. I did not. I kept telling myself I'd find one, that I had time, that surely this would slow down. It didn't. What I didn't know, what I only found out later, was that Garrett had been planning this for almost a year. The paperwork he handed me had been drafted by his firm's attorney, a man named Drew, who had apparently been golfing with Garrett since last spring. The settlement offered me 18 months of spousal support at a figure that sounded reasonable until you subtracted my rent, my student loans, and the fact that I had a car with a transmission problem I'd been ignoring since October. There was a clause in there about the house. We bought it together, or rather, we bought it with a down payment that came partially from my grandmother's inheritance. That clause gave Garrett the house outright. I signed it anyway. He wasn't cruel about it, which was almost worse. He was the same Garrett he'd always been. Measured, patient, a little distant. And watching him be that way while dismantling our life made me feel like I'd imagined the whole marriage. I moved into a 1-bedroom on Aldrich Ave, 3rd floor, no elevator. The movers I hired were 2 college kids who dropped my bookshelf on the stairs and apologized 11 times. I tipped them anyway. That night, I sat on the floor eating cereal because I didn't own a table yet, and I thought, I have to be okay. I have to figure out how to be okay. My apartment was small enough that I could hear most of what happened in the hallway. Footsteps, someone's dog scratching at a door on the 2nd floor, the man in 3B who played guitar badly on weekday evenings. What I did not expect was to look out my window one Saturday morning and see Eli Soto's truck parked on Aldrich Ave. He was helping a woman carry furniture into the building. Not my floor, 1st floor. He made 4 trips, accepted nothing for it that I could see, and left. I watched the whole thing like I was surveilling a crime scene. I told myself it was a coincidence. Providence was not that small, but Aldrich Ave was not far from Carver Street. The next time I saw him was at the farmer's market on Wickenden. He was buying coffee from the same stand I went to every week, and he was arguing, politely but definitely arguing, with the vendor about the ethics of single-origin roasts. I almost turned around. Instead, I waited in line behind him. He recognized me before I said anything. "Key lady," he said. "Eli Soto," I said, because it was the only thing I knew about him. He looked surprised, then almost amused. "You read my mail. You left your mail on my porch." "Fair." He stepped aside to let me order, and when I reached for my wallet, he'd already handed the vendor a 10. I tried to object. He shrugged like it was nothing, like this was just a thing he did. We stood at the edge of the market and drank our coffees, and I found out 3 things about him. He'd grown up in New Mexico. He'd spent 8 years in the Navy, and he now worked in consulting, which he said with the particular vagueness of someone who knows exactly what they mean and is waiting to see if you'll push. I didn't push. I told him I taught 3rd grade. He asked what I liked about it. Not why I chose it, not is it rewarding, but what I actually liked. I said the specific moment when a kid who's been struggling with a word suddenly reads a sentence cleanly, all the way through, without stopping. He nodded, like that was a real answer. We walked in the same direction for 2 blocks before realizing we weren't going anywhere together. We'd just both been walking. He said goodbye at the corner. I went home and graded spelling tests and thought about the way he'd listened. Garrett called the following Tuesday. He'd heard through someone that I was struggling. Struggling was his word, and he wanted to make sure the transition was going smoothly. He said transition like we were colleagues completing a handoff. I told him I was fine. He said that was great to hear, that he was proud of how mature we were both being, and then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd started seeing someone. A woman from his firm. She was 34, a partner track associate, driven in a way he'd always admired. He didn't say, unlike you. He didn't have to. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I called my mother, who lives in Tucson now, and talked to her for an hour without saying any of the things I actually felt. She said she'd always thought Garrett was too careful. I said, yeah, Mom. She said, you'll be all right, sweetheart. I said, I know. I didn't know. The next morning, I went down to get my mail and found a small clay pot sitting outside my door. It had a single stem of lavender in it, just planted, roots still adjusting. There was no note. I picked it up. I turned it over. It was handmade. You could see the thumbprint marks on the base. I brought it inside and put it on the windowsill where it would get morning light, and I stood there looking at it for longer than made sense. I didn't ask him about it until 2 weeks later at the coffee stand again. By then, it had become something close to a routine, not a plan, just 2 people who kept ending up in the same place on Saturday mornings. The lavender, I said. He looked at his cup, figured you might like something that doesn't ask much of you. I didn't know what to say to that. He didn't seem to need me to say anything. He started showing up in ways that didn't quite add up. Not in a threatening way. In a wait, why? Way. He helped me move my new table up 3 flights of stairs without being asked, which I could explain. He'd seen me struggling from the street. But then he mentioned, casually, that he'd noticed my car's registration was expired and reminded me the fine was significant if I got pulled over before I renewed it. How did he know my registration was expired? He'd been near my car once when I was loading groceries. One evening, I ran into him outside the building and he had a bag from the hardware store. He offered to look at the bathroom faucet I've complained about once, briefly in passing. He fixed it in 11 minutes. I stood in the bathroom doorway while he packed up his tools and I said, "Why are you doing this?" He sat back on his heels and looked at me. Doing what? All of it. The pot. The faucet. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. So why? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because you're managing everything by yourself and you're tired and I'm in a position to make a couple of things easier. That's all. It didn't feel like that's all. But I let it be that for a while. I want to be clear about something. I was not looking for anyone. I was barely looking for myself. But there's a thing that happens when someone pays attention to you. Real attention. Not the performative kind. After a long period of being invisible. Not invisible to the world. Invisible to the person who is supposed to see you most. Garrett had loved me, I think, in the way some people love a routine. Warmly, until it became background noise. Eli listened to things I said 3 weeks earlier and referenced them. He remembered that I'd mentioned my grandmother's name once and used it naturally the next time it came up, like he filed people carefully, like they mattered enough to be kept. I started to matter to myself again, a little. And the reflection of that. It scared me, honestly. He told me the truth about his work on a Thursday evening in November, sitting in my kitchen while I made soup that was definitely not going to be good. I'm not a great cook, I've made my peace with it. He'd started by telling me he wasn't really a consultant. That was technically accurate but misleading. He'd left the Navy 8 years into an intelligence career and transitioned into private sector work, risk assessment, asset protection, financial investigation for a firm with clients who mostly couldn't talk about needing a firm like that. He'd come to Providence 18 months ago for a job. The job had been, in his words, adjacent to my neighborhood. Then he paused. I set down my spoon. What does adjacent to my neighborhood mean? He looked at me steadily. There was a financial fraud investigation, a real estate attorney. Your husband's firm was connected to the case. Not Garrett directly, not at first, but close enough that I was watching the people around it. I sat down. You saw me, I said. At Carver Street. And here. Initially, yes. And the key. The farmer's market. The key was real. You were standing there and your key was broken. He said it plainly. Everything after that was also real. I'm telling you because you deserve to know how it started, not because it changes how it ended up. I didn't speak for a long time. He let the silence be what it was. Garrett, I said finally, was he involved? Eli was careful. His firm processed transactions for someone who was. Garrett signed documents. Whether he understood what he was signing is something the investigators are still sorting out. I thought about Drew, the golf attorney. I thought about the settlement I signed at a kitchen table while Garrett looked patient and measured across from me. The house, I said. Eli nodded slowly. The appraisal was incorrect. The equity you signed away was significantly more than the settlement reflected. Here's what I want to say about anger. It doesn't always arrive when you expect it. I wasn't angry that night. I was very calm, which frightened me a little. I finished making my soup. Eli stayed and we ate it in near silence, and it was, as predicted, not very good. He had seconds anyway. The anger came 3 days later at school in the middle of a reading group. I was listening to a kid named Jamie work through a paragraph about volcanoes, and suddenly I thought about 18 months of spousal support and a house my grandmother helped me buy, and a man who'd let his attorney drop papers in secret for a year while I planned our anniversary dinner. And I excused myself to the hallway for 4 minutes and breathed. I came back in and finished the reading group. Jamie got through the whole paragraph. That evening I called a lawyer. My own. Someone my colleague had recommended months ago when I was still telling myself I didn't need one. Her name was Audra. She was direct in a way I found immediately relieving, and she said, "Send me everything you signed. Everything." I did. What happened next took several months, and I won't pretend it was clean or swift or satisfying in the way revenge stories are supposed to be. Audra found 3 separate errors in the settlement documentation. The house appraisal discrepancy was significant enough that it constituted grounds for revisiting the agreement. The spousal support figure was below the statutory guideline for our income differential. Garrett hired Drew again. Drew was, by then, dealing with his own questions from the financial investigation. There was a mediation. Garrett came in looking like himself, composed, careful, the same patient man who'd sat across from me at our kitchen table. He looked at me and I think he expected the same woman who'd signed the papers the first time, the one who'd been too stunned and too tired to push back. I wasn't that woman anymore. Audra pushed. I held the line. By the end of it, I had a restructured settlement, a sum that actually reflected what I'd put into that house and the knowledge that I hadn't just handed it over. Garrett, for the first time since the divorce began, looked unsettled when he left. I sat in Audra's car in the parking garage for a minute before I could drive just to let it land. Eli and I didn't have a dramatic moment. There was no scene. There was an evening in February when we were walking Gordo along the river path, and it was cold enough that I could see our breath, and he said something that made me laugh. I can't even remember what. Something about the dog's opinions on geese. And when I looked over at him, he was already looking at me. And that was mostly it. We stood there for a moment in the cold and he said, "I like you a lot, you know. Not I love you. Not a speech. Just that, quiet and direct, like everything he said." "I know," I said. "And then because I did, I like you too." Gordo ignored this entirely and went after a pigeon. It was April when Eli told me about the property. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. He'd been looking at real estate in the area. He'd decided he was staying in Providence, which we hadn't really discussed directly, but which I understood to mean something, and he'd found a property. 14 Carver Street, he said. I looked at him. That's your old house, I said. I know. Garrett's house. Was Garrett's house, Eli said. He listed it 6 weeks ago. The investigation created certain financial pressures. He said this with no visible satisfaction, which somehow made it more satisfying. I made an offer. It was accepted. I didn't say anything for a moment. What are you going to do with it? Probably rent it initially, maybe renovate it. He paused. I haven't decided. I thought about Garrett listing that house, sitting across from a realtor at the kitchen table we'd picked out at the estate sale, having to explain what he needed for his asking price. Are you okay? Eli asked. Yes, I said. And I was genuinely, quietly, surprisingly okay. In September, my school started a new literacy program, and I got to design part of the curriculum. It was the best professional thing that had happened to me in years. I stayed late 3 evenings a week working on it, and Eli would sometimes bring food to the school parking lot, which my colleagues found hilarious, and I found impossible to be casual about. My mother came to visit in October. She met Eli on the second night and called me the next morning while he was making coffee downstairs and said, "He's the kind of man who listens with his whole face." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Your grandmother would have liked him." I looked out the window at the lavender on the sill, still alive, somehow, a full year later, growing in that small clay pot with the thumbprint on the base. Still adjusting. Still going. Yeah, I said, I think she would have. There is a version of my story that is about Garrett and what he did and what he lost. But that's not really the story. The real story is about a key that broke at exactly the wrong moment, and a man in socks who walked across a street without being asked. It's about lavender and second attempts and an 11-minute faucet repair and learning to hold a line when someone tells you what you're worth. It's about the fact that I signed those papers not because I was weak. I signed them because I was exhausted and alone, and I hadn't yet found my way back to myself. I found my way back. It turns out that was the part that mattered. I used to think that signing those papers was the worst thing I'd ever done. Not the divorce itself. The signing. The sitting down and letting it happen part. For a long time I carried that like it said something permanent about me. Like it was proof that when it counted, I folded. But I've been thinking about it differently lately. I was exhausted. I was alone. I had no lawyer, no plan, and a husband who'd been quietly building his exit strategy for a year while I was still trying to figure out what to make for dinner on Thursdays. Garrett didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he was prepared and I wasn't. That's not a character flaw. That's a circumstance. And circumstances can change. What I know now is that the choices we make when we're depleted are not the final verdict on who we are. They're just data. Information about what we were working with at the time. What matters, the part that actually defines you, is what you do once you've had a chance to breathe and think and find your footing again. Audra found 3 errors in that settlement. 3. They were there the whole time, sitting in the paperwork I'd been too overwhelmed to read carefully. The resources to fight back existed. They'd always existed. I just hadn't been in a place to access them yet. That's the thing nobody tells you about hard periods. The door doesn't disappear just because you walked past it the first time. Eli never told me what to do. He fixed a faucet and brought a plant and showed up with food in a parking lot. That's it, but there's a kind of care that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly makes the air around you a little easier to breathe. And in that easier air, I started thinking more clearly. I called Audra. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own story. I think about Garrett sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, mostly just with a kind of clarity. He made choices too. He chose a lawyer over a conversation. He chose a settlement that wasn't fair because he knew I wouldn't push back. Every one of those choices produced a consequence he didn't expect, because he'd built his plan around the version of me that existed in December, when I was too tired to fight. He didn't account for March. People rarely do. They mistake your exhaustion for your character. They see you at your lowest and they think that's the ceiling. It isn't. The lavender is still on my windowsill. It's been over a year now, and it's grown past the rim of the pot, which Eli says means it's time for a bigger one. I keep telling him I'll get around to it. I like that it's a little crowded in there, honestly. I like that it ran out of room and kept going anyway. That's the part I try to hold on to, on the days when things feel uncertain again. And there are still those days. Not the revenge. Not Garrett's face when he realized what he'd lost. Just the lavender. Just the quiet, stubborn fact of a thing that was replanted in hard circumstances and decided without any drama at all to grow.